I'd like to invite the GCIC President, Mr. Ruel Edwards, to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Mr. Edwards.
Her Excellency, Governor General of Grenada, Dame Cecile La Grenade, Minister of Economic Development, Trade, Planning, Cooperatives, International Business, Honorable Oliver Joseph, Private Sector Representative in the Senate, Senator Christopher Diali, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Timothy Antoine, Comptroller of Inland Revenue, Mr. Colin Forrester, our guest speaker, Mr. Ronald Harford, Chairman of Republic Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, the Executive Director and members of the Board of Directors of the Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce, our colleagues, staff of the Chamber, special invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, the media, good evening. Good evening. Oh, good. Excellent. Excellent. Want to make sure that you're still with us. I was told to stay on script, so I'm going to do my very best to stay on script, because tonight is important. It's important to celebrate, but it's also important to start a discussion on looking at the banking regulations and the implications going forward. The Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce is extremely delighted that so many of you from varying sectors that makes up the private sector, whether it large, medium, or small, have decided to join with us this evening to celebrate the achievements within the private sector. Every year, we look forward to this momentous occasion when we can withdraw from the intense competition within the marketplace to reflect on the accomplishments of our colleagues. Tonight's event is far beyond just the members of the GCIC, but it's an all-embracing seeking to recognize success from whichever part of the private sector that this may occur. As your president leading a very capable board of directors and secretariat, it behooves me to remark on the following. To first of all compliment the government of Grenada for the presentation of the 2016 budget that speaks to a number of areas that address the critical infrastructure required for our success within the private sector. To this end, we note with great eagerness the commitment of the government to address the thematic areas that will enable the improvement in our doing business ranking. The provision of tax credits for training to address our human resource needs, to build capacity and competitiveness, the ability to carry forward losses for 6 years, the commitment not to introduce any new taxes are all important and significant to the private sector. Your secretariat is also deeply aware of some of the challenges that we are confronted with in the private sector. That includes trade and access to markets. As Senator Diali would have echoed a couple days ago, for example, access for honey into the Trinidad market. Additionally, the lack of credible statistical data to support our business planning is evident. As we, your chamber, seek to become the gateway of information for doing business and for the private sector of Grenada, a new and improved website will be released within the first quarter of 2016. We are also constantly reminded of our labor code and the employment acts that are currently being reviewed. I wish to remind all of us that your financial support is paramount if we are going to be able to achieve the revised labor code and legislation that is balanced and that is in the private sector's interest. As Neil Ferguson wrote in his book, Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity and Poverty, a key ingredient that he identified for a strong nation is having a very strong financial system. This evening, we will see the commencement of a discussion on the implications that various reforms can have on our banking and financial sector. Our guest speaker this afternoon, Dr. Ronald Harford, Chairman of Republic Bank Limited, is a career banker who has celebrated over 52 years with service to Republic Bank Limited. He's a fellow of the UK Chartered Institute of Bankers, the Institute of the Banking of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Caribbean Association of Banking and Finance. He is the chairman of Republic Bank Barbados Limited, the chairman of Republic Bank Trinidad and Tobago, and the chairman of Republic Bank, Grenada Limited. He's also the chairman of Campaign Cabinet for Habitat for Humanity of Trinidad and Tobago. He's also the deputy chairman of the Arthur Lockjack Graduate School of Business, UE, a director of Caribbean Information and Credit Rating Services Limited, and a former director of the Grenada Industrial Development Corporation. Dr. Harford is a founding director of the Trinidad and Tobago Debates Commission and led the private sector funding that enabled the commission to establish and hold a successful political debate on local government. On August 31st, 2010, Dr. Harford was awarded the Chaconia Medal Gold of the Government of Trinidad and Tobago for his meritorious contribution to banking and the business community. He was also conferred an honorary doctorate by the University of the West Indies. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, having read only the cover of Dr. Harford's biography, I am sure you will agree with me that he is extremely capable of being the opening batsman for the discussion on our banking reform. Please join with me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Ronald Harford.
Governor General Dame Cecile La Grenade, Minister of Economic Development, Planning and Cooperatives, Honorable Oliver Joseph, Minister for Foreign Affairs, Honorable Clarence Modest, Private Sector Representative in the Senate, Senator Christopher Diali and Mrs. Diali, Permanent Secretary, Mr. Timothy Antwine, Mr. Curlin Forrester, Controller of the Inland Revenue, President of the Grenada Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Mr. Ruel Edwards and Mrs. Edwards, the Executive Director of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce, Mrs. Ophelia Lewis-Smith, Chamber Directors, Chamber members, staff of the Chamber, specially invited guests, and everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone has had a good dinner, very filling meal, and enjoyed the meal that they've just had. The subject that you have chosen for discussion, and as they say, the opening batsman on the subject, is in fact a very dry subject, right? And has a lot of intricate aspects to it, which I'm very glad you've had your meal, because if I was to speak before the meal, I think I would cause some of you some form of indigestion. Right? But I think being in Grenada at this time, the Americans have a wonderful tradition of Thanksgiving, which just passed, in which they give Thanksgiving for many things, for everything, right? And I think we too here have a lot to give thanks for. This country, and I look around here at this group here tonight, the significant cohesive support that I see that the industry and commerce is providing to the chamber in directing the affairs of the private sector and the country going forward, something to be very grateful for. You don't often see such a huge number of people coming out in what's a relatively small island, right, to support the efforts that you've seen here today. Right. One has also to be grateful that you've just come over a very challenging period in which the debt of the country has had to be restructured. It's taken quite a long time to arrive at the current position in which there's brought some finality to it. mind you, to the detriment of the creditors, of which I'm one, right? Right? So, and I think another aspect of tonight that has thrilled me is that quattro chord trio, right? Their music and the renditions that they have been absolutely wonderful. I think there's a band that has a very great future. I know the tune Get Loose is a Trinidad tune, but today they play that tune in Trinidad with a lot of aggression, you know, get loose, ah, ah, right? Whereas the rendition tonight, for the first time, I realized it's a beautiful tune. It's a beautiful tune. And it took the Quattro Trio to let me understand that. And I thank them for that. All right. All right. First then, I wish to thank the Chamber of Industry and Commerce for inviting me to speak with you this evening. I would like to share my thoughts and insights into a very critical piece of legislation, the new Banking Act of the Organization of the East Caribbean States. The changes expected with the promulgation of this new act will be far-reaching and will transform the very face of banking in the East Caribbean area. This act and the implications to follow will be a platform for further discourse on the age-old question, why do banks fail, and are we getting it right in preventing bank failures? This evening, I wish to add to that dialogue and present to you a new and possibly different perspective on financial regulation. A reinvention, as it were, of old concepts to new concepts that align with the reality of the experiences within the Caribbean and across the globe. With this presentation, it is hoped that we can get to the heart of the issue of financial regulation and perhaps even a workable solution. The new Banking Act proposes several changes in relation to the financial requirements for banks. Firstly, the increase in the minimum paid up or assigned capital that banks and other financial institutions are required to maintain in the territory in which they operate. For banks, there is an increase in capital of 300% from 5 million EC dollars to 20 million EC dollars. For other financial institutions, they are required to maintain 5 million EC dollars, up from 1 million EC dollars. That's one point. Second point, there's a proposed increase in the capital adequacy ratio from 8% to 12%, and substantial fines will now be levied against banks for non-compliance with these new capital requirements. And those who are not in the banking business, right? Simple mathematics, 8 12s are 96, right? So for $8, for every $100 you put in the bank, right? Okay, you had to have $8 in capital. Now you have to have 12. So you can only have 8 times the amount of capital in deposits, whereas before you had 12 times. So it compresses the capabilities of banks to take deposits in relation to the capital. So that's there is the imposition of rigorous restrictions and operating standards in respect of certain bank activities considered to be high risk. For example, loans to related parties and employees. That is to protect you from banks lending to friends, directors, staff members loosely, right? They have lots of restrictions now relating to those kind of loans. Investments in trade and outsourcing of certain functions within the bank, such as human resources and information technology. The acquisition of other companies and the reorganization of banking groups where non-financial and financial companies are affiliated. The expansion in the reporting and other monitoring requirements relative to the management of the bank and its board. And there's no shortage of that. Huge amount of reporting is now required on all aspects of the bank. I might just add as a little anecdote, the board of the main bank in Trinidad was very interested to find out why in the last couple of months there's an increase of over 100 staff in the bank, and the analysis showed that 85 of the 100 staff were there to provide information to the regulators, right? 85 of them, right? And it reminded me that some time back I had a discussion with the chairman of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, and we bemoaned the problems of regulator overburden. And I said to him, how many people do you have in HSBC handling governance and regulatory reporting? And he told me 6,000 people reporting, right? So undertaking a bank is no small deal. It is intended that the new Banking Act 2015 will benefit the East Caribbean financial sector in several ways. The first, there is a harmonizing of laws in the EC that are consistent with the international best practice. The Banking Act 2015 is based on the 2012 revised core principles of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. These core principles are the minimum standards that banks throughout the world reference in determining proper practices in the operations, governance, and supervision of banks and banking systems. Secondly, the provision of the new Banking Act are intended to strengthen the financial sector and allow local EC banks to better compete with international financial players. The higher licensing, capital adequacy, and reserve requirements now imposed on banks are intended to lead to the reorganization, merger, and consolidation of the less viable and more vulnerable banks in the EC, right? We are not alone in this regard. I mean, we have operations in Africa, Ghana, much the same story. New regulations coming in, and these smaller banks are in fact going to have to merge or consolidate with somebody down the line. The intention is to create stronger, more profitable banks that can better compete and be able to withstand contagion risks such as a financial crisis. Well-capitalized banks will be seen as attractive investments to foreign investors and rebuild investor confidence in the financial sector weakened by recent external shocks. The economic reality facing the East Caribbean territories at this time is most foreboding. We understand the issues facing the regulator and what may have been the impetus for the regulatory changes under the new Banking Act. The challenges come out of the global financial crisis and other external events have exacerbated the already difficult economic conditions that that already exist in the East Caribbean. Reduced exports and foreign reserves, falling government revenues, lower remittances, and employment are some of the key challenges facing the East Caribbean economies. The East Caribbean financial sector was not spared the contagion effect of the crisis. With the failure of the subprime mortgage market, the sharp decline in the real estate market, and the eventual collapse of Lehman Brothers in the USA in 2008, several regional financial services businesses experienced serious difficulties with the impairment of their asset portfolios. The negative consequences of the financial crisis to CL Financial, a regional financial group, and other financial institutions, for example, the Capital Bank that you know very much about, and the economic hardships experienced following the seizure of the Stanford Financial Group in Antigua illustrate the porous and vulnerable nature of the East Caribbean financial services sector to external factors. Economists blame the central bankers and regulators as well as the financiers themselves for these market crises. The East Caribbean Central Bank therefore actively pursued regulatory reform in the financial services sector, both at the national and the East Caribbean community level. The ultimate goal was the establishment of a united, internationally competitive, and self-sufficient EC banking sector, having strong controls and structures and protections for the vulnerable groups such as the consumer in the East Caribbean Currency Union. The philosophy behind the approach adopted by the central bank lies in its core belief that a micro-prudential risk-sensitive approach to regulation will ensure that individual banks have strong internal controls and adequate capital, and by having these elements in place, the financial system will be safe. Now let me explain what all that means. It means they decided that every little piece of asset that you put on your balance sheet, right, you had to do some sort of risk weighting and decide that of the capital that you have, so much is allocated to this particular asset. So they went through all the assets of the banks, right, almost with a microscope. A loan to John, that's a risky loan. We need to have 50% capital allocated to that, all right? And maybe a loan to the governments, which they thought was gilt edge, but we know different now. But and therefore we wouldn't put any capital for that, right? So that is the essence of the regulations. It says every little aspect of your operation has a risk, and every risk has to have part of the capital allocated to it. The central bank as well had extensive discussions with the industry, exchanging voluminous documents in an attempt to bring clarification and engagement on many of the issues underlying the proposed changes in the Banking Act. The industry dearly appreciates these efforts. There are, however, as there always is, certain concerns with the approach adopted by the central bank in the financial regulations of banks. These concerns I will now address, and as well offer another perspective on financial regulation for consideration by the market and the regulator. Stakeholders have intimated that the industry will face several challenges should the Act be promulgated in current form. To start, banks would be required to expend more funds from already shrinking profit margins to comply with the new capital adequacy, reserves, and other operational requirements. This will result in higher costs of doing banking business. Several banks will not be able to profitably survive under these new conditions and will be forced to go out of business. The effect of this will be the contraction of the financial services sector even further, where the smaller, less capitalized banks will be forced out of business. The first victims are usually the local indigenous banks. With the contraction of the financial services sector, the market for financial services will shrink, having fewer banks and fewer options for the financial consumer. There will be less diversity and competition in the East Caribbean banking sector, resulting in a possible stagnation in the market, reduced revenues, and decreased financial innovation and risk. The increased cost of doing banking business in the EC will also be a deterrent to further investment by larger multinational banks. These banks will consider whether there is any justification for their continued presence in the EC area, where investments are significantly smaller to their global or regional operations. There could be a further exodus of existing foreign banks and a widening of the gaps in the market for local financial services with the fallout of the small local banks. The decreased size of the EC market will also be a barrier to foreign investments by international or non-EC banks. The anticipated high operating costs and thin profit margins will dissuade any potential foreign investor. The service fees charged for banking products and services will also increase as banks seek to recover additional costs arising from heavier regulation. This will not be balanced against increased lendings, as the funds now available to the banks will be less, as the capital and reserve requirements, as I explained earlier, have increased. And moreover, after the experience of the last couple of years, risk appetite is now muted. These outcomes cannot be accepted as outcomes of good financial regulation, and may outweigh any benefits to be gained under the new regulation. The systemic character of banks flows from the very nature of the credit economy. One bank's borrower can be another bank's depositor, and that deposit serves to fund another bank's borrower, and so on. The failure of one bank causes the receiver to cease loans will bring down several other banks. This is the nub of the systemic risk problem. Connectivity in the banking system runs deep. No other industry is like this. It is also why regulators regulate banking sectors so closely and above and beyond other types of businesses. One of the guiding lights of financial regulation is to make all banks take greater precaution than they would if left to their own devices. These safety measures, however, should arise where a bank's size or connectivity increases the probability that its failure will generate systemic repercussions. Regulations should therefore seek that highly connected banks face tougher requirements than their smaller or less connected competitors. One size should not fit all as currently contemplated with the new Banking Act. And by reference, you would read quite often in the press about too big to fail, right? So this sentence, this paragraph is saying that those banks that have wide connectivity and have the possibility of contagion effect, the regulations should be more stringent there than elsewhere, and therefore don't pass regulations that's one size fits all. The design of the capital adequacy requirements, as postulated by regulators, seeks to be sensitive to the credit risk being taken, referred to as the risk-sensitive capital adequacy. There are, however, many challenges with this risk-sensitive approach. So as I get into the technical area, I think I better take a glass of water.